house prices have grown by approximately 7.2% annually. This means that over a 10-year time frame, your property price will roughly double. Meanwhile, the rate at which wages grow in value is only 3%, closer to what the consumer price index is. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the only way that the system can continue to produce these results over time is for interest rates to converge to zero. But that can't happen, because if it does, the whole system falls apart. It testifies to some degree of finiteness within the property asset class. So joining me today is Ashley Church. He's a political and market commentator with an extensive history in property, specifically here in New Zealand. It applies no matter where you are in the world. We're also going to be going off the beaten track and talking about some more nuanced macro themes that might suggest that there's more to worry about than Donald Trump and your property price in the future. I hope you enjoy. If you do, please give us a like, subscribe on the way through. Let's get started. Hey, welcome everybody. Today I'm catching up with market and political commentator Ashley Church. How are you, Ashley?
I'm good, Darcy. Nice to talk to you again. It's been a while.
Well, let's start from the beginning, because my big question that I've been pondering to myself lately and to people that I'm talking to is it the end of the world for the residential property market? And it's an uncomfortable question, especially when you're like directly or indirectly connected to the property industry when that's where your livelihood comes from, or at least the sentiment off the back of that. But I think it's important to be really honest with where things are at so that you can formulate strategies that are, in line with reality, not hopium. So just as a general, 30,000 foot overview of what the situation looks like here in New Zealand with respect to the property market, where are we right now with property?
Well, we're in a strange time, unlike anything that I've seen and many other commentators have seen for probably 40 years or more. And I should sort of presage that by just sort of indicating my own prejudices when it comes to property. The first of which is that that property has been broadly cyclic since about 1980 in this country. So by which I mean that you could predict with some degree of accuracy what it was going to do at any particular point in time within a broadly 10-year time frame. And the other prejudice, I guess, that I have, or presupposition that I have, is that house price growth in this country is almost entirely, by which I mean about 90% of house price growth is driven by the cost of money. So when money's cheap, house prices go up. When money's expensive, house prices stabilize, or as has been the case over the last few years, has gone down. All of that's gone out the window to some degree since about 2021, late 2021. And we've been through this airy, weird, no man's land, ghost land period where house prices haven't increased, nothing much has happened. We've all sat there fretting, wondering what's likely to happen over the next few years with the property market. And we're kind of still in that stage. There are some indications, Darcy, that we're coming out of it and that things will improve somewhat in the next little while. But hey, we said that a year ago. So, it's a very, very strange time. And, I'd be surprised if anybody could put a clear indication on what was going to happen with any degree of accuracy.
Yeah, it doesn't stop a lot of commentators from doing that.
No. Well, in fact, I've probably been one of those in the past. As I say, I had a very clear idea. I've adhered to this idea of a cycle, which has worked well for me for about 20 years. The market did pretty much exactly what I expected it to for a long time. But anybody who right now was indicating that they knew what it was going to do, I think that's folly. There are some broad themes that we can extrapolate if I'm right about what I said before, and that is that the cost of money is a primary driver of house price growth. Then there are some reasons to be confident, given what's happening with the Reserve Bank and the cost of money dropping. But even that, just a very strange time. We've been basically through 3, coming up 4 years of a very weird period, and I think most of us are just gun shy from it and looking for it to end and for the market to get on with doing what it's traditionally done in the past.
Which is not an unreasonable hope, because that's kind of what's always happened. It's a cyclical pattern, and I think where it gets tricky when you consider the last 4 years, it feels like there's been some sort of pause or gap, or we're questioning ourselves whether this cycle is actually now turning into a linear progression with a finite end date, right? Where things have changed. But
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there are people saying that. There are people saying that the fundamentals of the market have changed forever. I don't believe that. I can't prove that's not the case, but the reason I say that is because if you look at the change that's taken place in that period that we've been in, we know exactly when it started. It started in that period of extraordinary growth of house prices in 2020, 2021, which was caused primarily by the flooding of the market with cheap money by the Reserve Bank. And so we saw that enormous increase in asset prices. It was caused by the fact that money had come down in price, which, to be fair, confirmed what I said before, that the cost of money drives house price growth. And then we saw the opposite of that. We saw that fueled inflation. And as a result of that, the Reserve Bank reserved course quite quickly and started putting up mortgage interest rates, or the OCR, which influences mortgage interest rates, very quickly over the next sort of 12 months after that. And that's impacted on interest rates since then. And so we've now seen a reversal of that. We've seen that the Reserve Bank's got inflation back under control. As a result of that, it has cautiously been moving the OCR down, which has allowed the trading banks to bring mortgage interest rates down. There is some indication that that process hasn't finished yet. In the past, if we'd got down to about 4.99, which I think is about where the 12-month rate is at the moment, you would have expected that in itself, just based on history and experience, would have started to fuel some enthusiasm for the market. But there's some other stuff going on at the same time, which I think is also a factor. There's the lowering of immigration, or the reduction in immigration. There's uncertainty about job security. And then there's just the whole world economy thing, which is taking place at the moment under the as a result of what's going on in the Trump Republican government in the US, and I guess just the uncertainty that people are feeling. So under normal circumstances, I think we would have been back to business as normal by now. But I was describing this the other day to somebody, Darcy. It's a bit like having been in a boxing ring in a fight, and every time you get punched and you're doing your 10 count and you get up on the 9 and then you get hit again. And that's happened to us for about 4 years. So we're waiting for the boxing match to finish and we can just get on with life.
That's a good way of looking at it, right? Because whenever you're kind of dazed and confused like that, all you can really do is remember the patterns, remember what the historical trends are. And I think a lot about growth rates in property, because I kind of believe that the entire economy is built on the base layer of housing. Housing is the conduit by which new currency comes into existence, right?
Totally.
And
in fact, I did I think you and I may have talked about this before, but I did a study back in 2018, 2019 of what had actually happened to the market since 1980. And there was no specific reason to use that. It was just a starting point. And I asked one of the major property data companies to produce data for me indicating what had happened to house price in each year of each of those decades. And I won't bore you with the minute detail, but basically what it showed is that house prices had almost exactly doubled in each decade since 1980. In fact, it was within a very small percentage difference in each of those decades. It was fascinating. But the last decade, the one leading up to 2020, it hadn't doubled. It had taken about 12 years instead of 10. So we had 1980 to 1990, 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010, very predictable market. And then that last decade, it had taken just a little bit longer, just a couple of years longer. And I think the reason for that was because even though cheap money or lower interest rates were a driver of house price growth, we were starting to reach a physical barrier where, just given the actual cost of a home itself, particularly for first-time buyers, it was becoming more difficult for people to actually afford to spend more than not so much a fixed amount, but a certain amount. So what I read that to mean at the time, and I still think it's a truism, is that house prices will continue to double, but it might take 13 years or 14 years or 15 years. So the rate of that growth will slow over the next 2 or 3 decades.
And that's interesting because I look at this as I don't know if trilemma is the right way of looking at it, but you have interest rates, you have the property price growth rate, and then you have the wage growth rate, which is roughly mirroring CPI, right? And so there's obviously diminishing returns, which does kind of speak to what you're saying, where it might take longer to see the doubling, but the only reason why this can happen is because there's space between where interest rates are today and zero. And as long as there's space in between there, it can kind of balance those two pieces. Would you kind of
No, I completely agree. Firstly, well done on recognising that there's three rather than two pieces to that, because when you read media commentary on this, most parties tend to focus on house prices and household income. They forget about the interest rate being the third component. So you're absolutely correct, because that's actually a really important component which influences those two other things. But in terms of the ability for house prices to keep increasing within those three factors, there is also, and I can't define this, I just know it to be true, there's also a sort of a psychological element. And so if it goes from 4.99 for a 1 year mortgage fixed to, let's say, 3.99 over the next couple of years, that in itself is our driver. What's interesting about that, though, is if interest rates were to go back up to, say, 5.5 or 5.6 and then came down again, just the mere fact that they come down as a driver in and of itself. So yes, it is about the cost of money, but there is also an element of it which is about saying, hey, the cost of money is coming down, therefore I'm going to get back in the market, and FOMO is going to kick off and all that other stuff that makes the market work. So it's primarily about the actual cost, but there is a psychological element which we will see kick in once the market recovers. We'll see people starting to respond to the fact that it's simply about the cost of money coming down. And I can say that with some certainty because, and you'll know better this than I will, but I think we got as low as 2.99 or just over 3% in 2020, and then rates went up. And so at the moment, and let's say they get to 3.99, they're still going to be considerably higher than they were at that 2.99. But the fact that they've dropped from 4.99 is a psychological motivator, which will cause people to start buying again. I hope I made sense with that.
No, it makes sense. So it's kind of like it's where things are at, but it's also the direction that things are traveling in, which triggers the emotion, which becomes that reinforcing.
Yep.
So thinking about, though, like the rate at which the value of our labor grows over time, or the inflation rate built into wages over time, roughly matching CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, and then thinking about the rate at which property values grow over time, would you suggest that wage growth or property prices are a better measure of what's really going on with the general rise of prices? Like, which one actually accurately captures inflation, CPI or house price growth rates?
Oh, I think that the answer is both, because they measure different things. So the CPI is an indication of what's going on a day-to-day basis. Keeping in mind, it's important to understand for your viewers that the CPI is what's called a basket of goods. So it's not necessarily an indication of everything that's taking place that you might purchase at any given point in time. It's about goods that and I can't remember whether it's Stats New Zealand or the Reserve Bank, but one of those two party uses is determining where the CPI sits. So for example, every once in a while they'll add something to it. They might say marshmallow biscuits or something strange is included in that mix. But I still believe that's a better measure, because it's the stuff that people are actually buying on a day-to-day basis. I think house prices, and you're quite right, it inflates differently, serve a different purpose. That's more about long-term wealth. And so house price growth isn't so much showing us what's going on within the general economy. It's showing us what's going on within that particular asset. And I think one of the reasons I probably have a different view on that to other economists is because New Zealand has a different approach to property to most other nations. Australia is probably the one exception to that. In the States, Canada, the UK, other parts of Europe, there are a variety of different investment classes. There are lots of things that people can invest in. And quite deep capital markets. That's changed to some degree over the last 10 or 15 years in New Zealand, where access to foreign share markets has become easier. So we can invest in those things. But by and large, Kiwis see their first form of investment as firstly their house, and then residential investment property as an investment class. And the reason we do that is because it's relatively easy and accessible in this country, and has been for a long time, and B, just because we understand it. So I've gone on record, and I'll say it again. I think Kiwis probably understand residential property investment better than anybody else in the Western world. And the reason that's happened is because we've had to, because it's been the only thing that we could really invest in consistently over long periods of time. We haven't had that access to other forms of investment that perhaps other nations have had.
Interesting. Yeah. And I guess since the 87 stock market crash and the subsequent scar tissue that left on a lot of our psyches, that was inevitable, right? And I guess, again, I wonder if the opposite might be potentially unfolding, or if it could unfold, where this 4-year gap, we're in this bit of a funk. We're wandering through the desert here, wondering when we're going to enter the promised land of recovering house prices. I wonder if that's going to leave a scar, which then turn the next generation to shares, to equities, to crypto, to commercial property versus residential property, to anything other than that which has been so interfered with in the last few years. What do you think?
Yeah, I'll give you two answers. So, firstly, I think it will. I don't think there's any doubt that it will leave a scar, and that the residual effects of that scar will be with us for a generation. In that we will look back. If you think about the way we look back on the GFC, this is much worse than the GFC was in terms of residential property investment or residential property. And so we will see this and we will remember it, and it will be the thing that media refer to whenever they talk about property. Having said that, I don't think it will be so big as to stop us actually investing in property. And it's my strong belief that once the market recovers, whenever that point is, whether it's 6 months from now, 12 months from now, or whenever, once that happens, we will shake off that effect in the short term. And we will simply get it back to doing what we've traditionally done every 10 years, which is having a 6 or 7 year property boom. And once that starts, it will gather momentum very quickly. And once that momentum gathers, we'll forget about most of the stuff and we'll just get on with it.
Yeah, I know, and it's always the case, right? Like when you're in the summer, hard to imagine the winter, hard to imagine the summer. When you're sick,
Yep.
hard to imagine being healthy. But like, sure as day follows night, people are gonna feel optimistic again. They're gonna FOMO in again. But what you were saying before around property prices will probably still double, like nothing stops this train, but it might just take a little bit longer. So instead of a 7.2% annualized growth rate, maybe somewhere in the sixes is kind of what you're alluding to. Is that right?
Or 7.2%, but for over several years, but not for as many as it. So previously, it was an average of
Sure.
7.2% over 10 years, but it was actually, if you looked at within those individual years, it was actually higher over a 7 year period. So I don't know how you
Sure.
annualize that out, but let's say it was
Right.
9 or 10% for 7 years, and then 3 years where it was flat. It might be 10 or 11 or 12 for 4 years, and then flat for 6. So the complexion
Mm.
of the way that the market works, for example, could change. Interestingly, just talking about that whole change in psyche in the market, though, and I've been making this prediction for a while, and I'm looking forward to it actually being fulfilled. But at some point, whether it's 6 months from now, 12 months from now, well, it won't be 6 or 12, but it might be in 18 months, we will get to a point where the media will be talking about the fact that house prices have surpassed the highest peak that they reached in 2021. So we will reach that point, and then all of the media talk at that stage will be how will the government intercede to control house prices because they're out of control. So that will come back again in the same way that it did in the 2018, 2019 through to 2021. That will return. It's just a question of how long it will take to get to that point.
Thank you. Okay. So when I think about the bank's forecast, like I get probably updates at least once a day, either from news sites or actually directly from banks, saying what their forecasts are with property prices, what their forecasts are with where the official cash rate will be at the end of the year. And then I see what the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is saying as well. And at the moment, it feels like most of the banks are fairly optimistic in terms of where property prices are going. Somewhere between 5 to even all the way up to 10% is where they're forecasting property prices, and where they're forecasting the official cash rate is lower than where the Reserve Bank is forecasting it as well. So in your view, do you think that there's like a slight conflict of interest here, that bank economists who are forecasting these things?
It's not a slight conflict of interest; it's a massive conflict of interest, but it's always been there, and it's ameliorated to some degree by the fact that there are several of them. So it's not as if there's a monopoly provider; they're in competition with each other, and they're all saying different things. So one of the things I love, and when I say love, I make sport of it. About the bank's approach to predictions about house prices, for example, is that they're invariably wrong. And whether we're talking about market going up or market coming down, the banks get it wrong. They just do. And occasionally one will get it right because it's 12
Got a
o'clock
luck.
twice in any given day. So for that reason alone. So yeah, there is a conflict of interest, but they're so lousy at it that I don't think it matters, because it actually doesn't guide the market because they're just not correct.
Yeah.
And so look, they've kind of got to do it. It's part and parcel of the stock and trade of being a bank. You kind of got to throw an economist out there for the media, and you've got to make predictions from time to time to get a bit of airplay, which they do. but it really shouldn't play too much of a role in helping people determine what's going on with the market, because even within themselves, the banks can't agree with what the market's going to do, up or down.
Right. And considering that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, who ultimately calls the shots in terms of where the official cash rate goes, considering they're significantly lower than where the banks are saying it at, do you think that this is kind of like a subtle way, or not so subtle way, that the banks are effectively communicating to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand what ought to happen?
Yeah, probably. I don't know that the Reserve Bank takes a lot of notice of that anyway, but I suspect it's a little bit like any commentator on any topic trying to influence the government by getting into the media and making a statement on something. I put it into that sort of category. Having said that, the Reserve Bank itself hasn't exactly covered itself in glory over the last few years either. I mean, it was the Reserve Bank that created this crisis. Let's not lose sight of that. The fact that we're in the position we're in now is almost entirely. You can give a little bit of the blame for that to the last Labor government, and almost the entire rest of that blame goes to the Reserve Bank. They overshot the mark, and then they overshot the mark again in the other direction. And to the extent that we went into recession and the economy tanked, the Reserve Bank created that tanking. Now, they had to do that because they'd made such a big mistake by pushing rates down, that they had to do what they did in order to get inflation back under control. But let's not lose any sight of the fact that it was their doing. So Adriana was gone, which I'm certainly not losing any sleep over. And I'm looking forward to somebody who actually focuses on what the Reserve Bank does and not all the other woke nonsense that the Reserve Bank's been doing over the last 4 or 5 years, to get the bank back into some level of credibility, such as we had from that bank until about 2010.
So I think that whole viewpoint that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand was actually responsible for the house price boom and the subsequent recession that they had to engineer, like majority of it was their fault, yet no apologies given. Adrian Orr resigned without advance warning, no reason given. What's your view, though, around why he resigned?
Oh, so as I hear it, I mean, my guess is as good as yours, so it's all based on gossip at the end of the day. But I understand he had a shouting match with the Minister of Finance in her office and resigned immediately, over who knows what. I would imagine it was over perhaps some determination of his direction from her, which technically she can't give because it's an independent position. But I suspect she's indicated she was going to do one thing and he wanted another. And I also, in fact, sorry, now that I mention it, there was also some skullduggery around the quite dramatic increase in the budget provision for running the Reserve Bank and I'm not going to mention the numbers because I'll invariably get them wrong, but there was, I think, about a 40 or 50% increase in the cost of running the Reserve Bank over the last 2 or 3 years. And I think Willis, and I support her in this, was saying to him, but that's not going to fly. So we're going to cut you back to where you were 4 years ago. And I think that was probably the contributing factor. But look, that could all be wrong. So, I'd like to think it was over some moral principle, but I doubt it. I suspect it was over some sort of petulant turn that he had over something that he didn't like. Interestingly, you talk about them not apologising. To be fair, I can't believe I'm saying this, it's difficult for a Reserve Bank governor to take responsibility for a mistake because the whole basis for that office is built on confidence. It's built on the idea that they can never, it's kind of like the Pope of money. It's built on this idea that they can never be wrong, and that sort of everything they say is ex cathedra and comes from the mouth of God. And so the idea that they would apologise and say they got something wrong would undermine confidence in that institution, even though it would, probably be correct.
That totally makes sense. Confidence is key, right? So long as they believe you can get away with it. And
Totally.
wasn't that one of his quotes? But I think it's fascinating, though, that there does seem to be a vibe, like feels like there's some sort of vibe shift going on where confidence has been lost in the Central Bank of New Zealand, but also central banks generally, because this was a mistake that was mirrored all over the world. And that kind of taps into a broader theme, which I think started to become quite apparent since 2020, which was this theme of centralization in terms of big financial decisions like central bank policy. And I know, the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, and Jabba the Hutt that heads it up, Augustine Carson's, that whole kind of system where it seems to be like a top-down hierarchical approach. That culture seems to be evident in each of the branches of the central banks as well, which also leads to that hubris, or the lack of the ability to apologize because it is their way or the highway, because it has to be, like you say. But do you think that culturally, or even just like generally, home buyers are becoming more aware of how central banks work and how their interference actually exacerbates natural market cycles?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I think home buyers are quite naturally and understandably reacting to the stimuli that's immediately in front of them, and
Right.
and most of them wouldn't even be aware that the role that the Reserve Bank plays. I think home buyers, particularly first home buyers, have looked at the market over the last 3 or 4 years and have recognised that something's wrong, and that's made them understandably cautious.
Mm.
And in similar fashion to the way that you saw a dramatic drop in listings for several years as a result of the fact that I think a lot of Kiwis who might otherwise have been in the market to sell their home looked at the fact that the house had come back 20% in value and said, I'm not going to sell in this market because my house is worth more. And then over the last 12 months, when you saw some green shoots that appeared to be starting to emerge, then you saw that flurry of activity, and suddenly people who perhaps had waited for several years started to put their homes onto the market. And so now you've got an oversupply in the market of available listings, whereas previously you had an undersupply. So those things in both cases, I think, are natural responses to things that people saw in the market that they thought, rightly or wrongly, were a guide to what was going to happen next and what they should do in that market.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now, just zooming way out and thinking now over a much longer time frame than property prices doubling every 10 years, there's cyclical changes that we can observe through life. There's the seasons, there's the business debt cycle, there's secular trends, generational trends that we can see over time, and then there's other trends that play out over a much longer time frame. And again, it speaks to this whole question that we always have whenever there's like a Braxton Hicks moment where we're going through a cycle where it feels like it's the real thing, and then it's not. You can get lulled into this sense that, hey, everything just, there's nothing new under the sun. It just keeps on going around and around. But every now and then things change significantly. And you're probably one of the few people I could have a conversation with around property and eschatology. So I'm going to take full advantage of that, Ashley, and warning for everybody listening. This is probably not something that you're normally going to hear, but Ashley, just at a high level, last time you were on the show, we talked a little bit about your Christian faith and how that influenced your life and your worldviews as a result of that. But at a really high level, can you just give us the bird's eye view of what most, and not every Christian believes the same thing, but what do most Christians kind of expect in terms of where the world is going?
This is a field of Christianity called prophecy prediction. So it's about taking the writings of Scripture and extrapolating or interpreting from those what they mean for the future. And there's five main ones. There's what's called preterism, which we can pretty much discard because it's a view that all of prophecy happened between the 6th century BC and the 1st century AD. And I think we can pretty much just, as I say, disregard that because it hasn't played out that way. There's a second one called amillennialism, which basically means that it's all just symbolic, and that we can't actually take anything literal from Bible prophecy because it's going to it's all just symbolism. And organisations like the Catholic Church, for example, are amillennial. So are the Eastern Orthodox Church and quite a number of Protestant denominations. And then there's three others. There's one called historicism, which believes that prophecy has been playing out over the last couple of thousand years. And then the last two are there's one called what's called futuristic, and they've got a subtle difference between them. One of them is called postmillennialism, and that's based on the idea that there's going to be Christ is going to return, and there's going to be 1,000 years of him ruling the earth, and then at the end of that, everybody's going to be judged and go to heaven or hell. And then there's one called premillennialism, which is the one I'm going to focus on. And premillennialism believes that we're about to enter into a period, which is what you were alluding to, where a whole range of things are going to happen very quickly prior to the return of Christ, the Messiah. And so if you fall into that premillennial school, and most of the people who believe in prophecy interpretation or follow it, I shouldn't say believe it, people who follow it are premillennial in their view. So
Yeah.
American Christianity's really focused on premillennialism. It's this idea of an antichrist and a tribulation, a rapture, and a whole range of other stuff that they believe is still ahead of us. A mark of the beast is another one that people will have heard of. And so I take a slightly different view to that. So if I were premillennial, I would believe that we are in something called the last days, which basically just means that we are in the last period of history, which could be, 10 more years, 20 more years, or 5 more minutes. So nobody knows. And that during that, there will be a range of events, almost a checklist of things that will happen. And so to answer your question, if you were in that school of biblical interpretation, then you would be looking now to think about not just what should you be doing for your future, but how does that planning for your future interplay with investment decisions that you might make, and in fact life decisions in general, because those decisions will be very much framed by your worldview. I have a different view. I don't buy into that premillennial worldview. I used to completely buy into it. I've changed that over the last 10 or 15 years as I've been first studying and then writing a book on this topic, which I think you and I talked about last time, and it's still not finished. But it has framed my frame of reference quite differently. And the key ways it's changed my frame of reference are that rather than there being a series of events before our return of Christ, that return of Christ will be just like that, and that there won't be a whole range of other things that happen first. And so within either of those views, the premillennial view or the view that I'm espousing, it does pose the same questions, though, Darcy, which are what do I do now? And so there's a school of thought that says, well, you divest yourself of everything because you don't want to be encumbered with anything, and you basically just wait on a mountaintop, as that has happened in the past. There's another school of thought that says you make wise decisions, so you make sure that you prepare yourself so that if society is to change, that you're able to sustain those changes over a period of time. But it's a movable feast. And even within that premillennial view that I talked about, you'll find people have got different views about what that's going to mean. So, for example, some will say, they'll talk about this thing called the tribulation, which is the idea that there's this period of persecution for Christians ahead of us, which, again, I'm of the personal view that that's behind us. However, if you were of the view that it was in the future, then that breaks down into and I won't bore you with the details, but it transcends over a 7-year period. And some Christians believe that they'll go through a period of suffering for 3.5 years. Some believe that that'll be at the beginning. Some believe that'll be at the end. Some believe they'll go right through the whole thing. Some believe that they won't go through it at all. They'll be taken away before it comes. So with all of those moving parts and with all of that confusion for people who are Christians but don't necessarily understand the interplay between that and their financial security, I guess it comes down at the end of the day to saying, what's the worst case scenario and how can I prepare for that? And the worst case scenario is that there would be a terrible time of persecution, and therefore to the extent that they could control their circumstances up until that time, they would position themselves and prepare themselves accordingly by making sure that their asset situation's the best that it can be in order to help them to survive. Long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's good. It's an area that you're probably not going to hear on too many property-related podcasts, right? Like that just doesn't come up. But the reason why this came up for me anyway is I've been having these conversations with a growing cohort of people who have like purposely decided that no, we're not going to buy property. We're not going to buy our own home. We're going to divest ourselves of the property that we own, and not necessarily because of what we're talking about here, but because they believe that the asset class itself is broken. And typically they'll be piling into Bitcoin, and it's about buying sound money or gold, an analog version of sound money. And that is a way of, I guess, protecting your wealth. It definitely is a way. And that was one part of it. And then I'm aware of this part of it that we're talking about here with end times thinking and just the whole question, right? Like, if the end of the world is here, shouldn't I just rent? Like, should I even bother buying a home? Should I actually get on with my life? And I think that regardless of what your views are, even if you just think that, hey, Trump is the Antichrist and he's going to destroy the world, therefore we need to do, fill in the blank. It is so easy, isn't it, to be either encouraged to do a good thing, but for the wrong reasons, or just be deceived and do the wrong reasons. And over the past 5 years, I think we've seen a lot of examples of deception increasing in this way. And so I guess the question I'm trying to get to here is, do you feel like, again, in a bit of an echo chamber here, but do you feel like people in general are aware that culture around the world is changing, or are people kind of just going along with what they've always done and completely ignorant to this sort of thing?
Oh, it's absolutely aware that culture's changing, and in fact, society's been being divided along very clear lines now, in a way that even 4 or 5 years ago, in fact, in a way that up until COVID wasn't the case. But prior to COVID, you could go to a barbecue, certainly here in New Zealand or Canada or the US or Australia or the UK, and have a chat with somebody who was of a completely different political outlook than you, and have a conversation, and have that conversation in good faith and civilized. That's increasingly difficult to do. So views have become increasingly entrenched, and the positions that people take have become increasingly entrenched. So there's definitely something in the water. There's definitely, now, whether that's a spiritual thing or whether that's just a reflection of a divided world. There's all sorts of views on this. There's people that would say that, Western civilizations lasted longer than most people would have expected it to, 250, 300 years in its current democratic form, and that therefore, that it was always going to collapse and be replaced with something else. There's others who will say, no, this is a satanic thing, and it's being caused by, controls and entities that are beyond and above us that we don't know are there. I tend to fall into the middle of those two, particularly with that sort of eschatological hat on that you talked about before, where I do believe that we're in the last days, and therefore I think there's definitely stuff taking place at the moment which is influencing the way that we think. But yeah, to come back to your question, there is clearly a divide in society that people can see, and that comes down to, to use lazy terms, it's the left and the right thing. It's left wing versus right wing, and that was honed in the fires of COVID, certainly in this country, but it has become much more developed and much more pronounced. Trump is a prime example of a reaction to that phenomenon. Trump is the current American reaction. That might change in 4 years' time, but that's what it is right now. Italy's another, Argentina's another, and then on the other side of the spectrum, what's happened in Australia and Canada over the last few weeks. Australia this weekend, and Canada a couple of weeks ago, where society's moved, you could argue, to the left, or has stayed on the left. So what that means for the world, what it means for assets, what it means for our financial security and safety over the next couple of years, I mean, I wish I could give you a clearer answer on that, but at the moment it's unfolding in a way that I think we're observers to. None of us necessarily understand how this thing's going to play out, except that we're on the bus. We're part of the journey.
Yeah, that's right. And so just staying on the Christian theme a little bit, Matthew, in the book of Matthew 24, in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, there's all sorts of mention of these themes, right? And like you said before, there's a lot of different ways that you can interpret all of these things. So, accepting that, things like geopolitical tensions, like next level, global war, changing financial systems, rapid technological changes. You're touching on some of the cultural shifts. Do you feel like these are all data points, or these are the primary reasons why the return of Christ might be imminent, or is it something else? Okay.
So I don't, and I'll explain why in a moment. If I was of a premillennial disposition, I've explained premillennialism before. It's a particular view which most people that strongly adhere to Bible prophecy follow. Those people would argue that these are all signs of something called the mark of the beast, which is this idea of an imprint on your hand or your forehead that's going to stop you being able to buy or sell or transact. They would argue that's all tied up with this idea of an antichrist, a character who's going to, supposedly charismatic figure, who's going to take over the world and who's going to control both the financial system and in fact all measures within society, and a range of other things that prophecy would tend to indicate. So if you buy into that view, then you would look at the world at the moment and you would say, hey, this stuff appears to be a fulfillment of prophecy. There are things going on at the moment that would suggest to me that we are rushing headlong toward kind of the same stuff that I'm reading about in the book of Revelation and Daniel and other books. And so it would tend to indicate to me that we are very much following the track that those prophecies tend to indicate. Having said that, and I'll sound like a hypocrite, I don't believe that. I'm of the view that that the prophecies that you've just referred to relates specifically to the Jewish people into the Middle East, and that they're actually not about Western Christianity at all. And that comes back to what I said before, which is that I'm very clearly of the view that the next event on the prophetic calendar for Western Christians is the return of Christ, which is different to what premillennialism argues. Premillennialism would say that the return of Christ is about eighth on a checklist of 8 or 9 things, and therefore that's not yet, because all this other stuff's got to happen first. So it really depends on where you sit. Most people watching this who are Christian will fall into that former camp. They will believe that these things are about to happen to us, and therefore they will be looking at what's going on around the world and seeing those things as a fulfillment of prophecy. Interestingly, you mentioned Trump before. So again, I don't believe in a literal antichrist in the way that premillennialists do. But if you did, you wouldn't look too far shy of Trump as a potential character to fit that particular description, because in terms of the biblical description of what an antichrist would look like, he's not far shy of that. He ticks a lot of boxes. So it's an interesting time.
Yeah. Now you were in Israel last year. Yeah, towards the anniversary of the October 7 massacre. So obviously that's the Israel birthplace of Christ. And it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting exercise to actually understand some of this history and how the Jewish people view God versus Christian people. And a lot of people would say, hey, the Christian church has replaced Israel. Personally, I wouldn't take that view. I don't think you would take that view either. But what was your general viewpoint on the ground? Like when you were over there, do you want to just take me through what it was like actually being there, and did it change the way that you view end times?
Didn't at all. In fact, it reinforced it. So let me just start by saying what my view is and how Israel fits into it. So my view is that prophecy in the book of Daniel, all of the prophecy in the book of Daniel, and a substantial proportion in the prophecy in the book of Revelation is about Israel. And that's at odds with most people will see the book of Daniel as being about Christians. I reject that entirely. I think I'm very clearly of the view, and I written about this, that it's entirely about the Jews and Israel, and particularly the city of Jerusalem, and all prophecy comes off that as a result. So one of the reasons I was over there, and obviously one of the reasons I'm such a big supporter of Israel per se, is because I adhere to that view. I believe very strongly that Israel is the primacy of the focus of prophecy in these last days that we're in. So when I went over there, it was really to confirm and to understand. I'd been talking about Israel, I'd been defending it through social media and through media, and it was important to me that if I was going to do that, I need to have actually seen what took place on the 7th of October in 2023, so that I could speak with some conviction and not just talk second or third hand, as a lot of people were doing. So during that visit, I visited the site of the Nova Music Festival. That was a site where a very large number of Israeli, mainly young people, were killed. Many women were raped, but also one of the kibbutzim that was attacked. There was a number just outside of the perimeters of Gaza City, and just the atrocity that had taken place there. Also visited the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and during that visit had the opportunity to view a video which was essentially a composite of footage that had been gathered up from that event. So some of that was people's cell phones, some of it was car phones, CCTV, but a substantial proportion of it came from GoPros that was on the head of the terrorists themselves, filming themselves undertaking these absolute hideous atrocities that they did during that time. And that would, Darcy, I don't think anything has moved me as much as in my entire life. And so to watch people, because remember, they were seeing other terrorists, and so they were being filmed on these GoPros, to see people, the atmosphere that was created was more like a football match where people were cheering and high-fiving each other after scoring a goal. It was hideous. I'm okay about it now. It was about 6 months ago, but for a while, every time I thought about it, it would bring me to tears. It was just horrifying. So there was that, and then to see the resilience of the Israeli people, both in terms of what was happening within Israel. And when I say the Israeli people, I should make a point too, that when I talk that the Israeli people, so in other words, the people who make up the country of Israel, about 6 million of them are Jewish, 7 million of them are Jewish, and about 2.5 million of them are Muslim. So, and people don't know that. They think about Gaza and they think about the West Bank or Samaria. and they tend to think of them being completely separate. But in fact, about 2.5 million of the people who live in Israel are actually Muslims, and those are the people who stayed in Israel in 1948 when the War of Independence took place, and they just became Israeli citizens. And those people, a substantial proportion, not all of them, but a substantial proportion of those Muslims are very strong supporters of Israel, very proud of their country, and many of them serve in the IDF and have the same views as the Jewish people who live in Israel about the safety and the security of their country. And that's something it's always been important to me that people understand that. Obviously, it was important to understand what was happening within the country, but the other thing that's been happening over that time is the extraordinary anti-Semitism, which took place almost immediately after the events of 7 October themselves. And the coordinated, and it's clear that it was coordinated, the coordinated action that was taken to pursue a narrative, a pro-Hamas narrative, which had this been any other country, had this been New Zealand, had this been Ireland, had this been any other nation, and had the same events which transpired in Israel taken place in those countries in the same way, the world would be completely on side with that nation against the terrorists that had attacked them. But for some reason, and in fact, it's not for some reason, let's be clear, it's anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, because of this spiritual thing that we refer to as anti-Semitism, but is in fact just Jew hatred. We have seen an outpouring of suppressed hatred of Jews that's been suppressed for a long period of time, perhaps since World War II, re-emerging in the world, and this massive increase in anti-Semitism against the nation that was attacked by these animals on the 7th of October, which I just find extraordinary. Actually, I don't really, because I understand where it's coming from, but it's a hideous thing. And if nothing else, it's a confirmation of God's word, and it's a confirmation of the reality of the evil that resides at the moment in the world and which is driving this stuff.
Where does this Jew hatred come from?
Well, read my book. So
I'm waiting for it to come out, actually.
Well, it's not far away now. So the quick snapshot, and I'm only giving you the snapshot to understand where it sits in the book. I quite strongly put a case to say that the Book of Revelation is not one vision; it's 7 different visions, and of those 7 different visions, 4 of them deal with the past. So 4 of them deal with things that have happened in the past. So it takes the same period of history and looks at it through 4 different lenses, basically, and then the last 3 all deal with the future. Now, the reason I mention that is because the third of those 4 visions that have passed is actually titled The Rise of Anti-Semitism, and it deals with chapters 12 to 14 of the Book of Revelation, which are not separate visions. It is one contiguous vision that runs right through, which tells you exactly where anti-Semitism came from. And so it started with the birth of Christ, obviously, and if you've read chapter 12 of the Book of Revelation, you'll understand that's what that chapter refers to. It talks about the woman with the crown of the sun, and goes right through to the 144,000 Jews on Mount Zion in chapter 14. So where it comes from is it's very clear from that story that anti-Semitism arose as a result of the birth of Christ and has continued over the last 2,000 years. And the reason for it, and there's a couple of very key parties, which you might want to edit these out because they're controversial, but I'll tell you who they are in a moment. The reason for it is because Christ made very clear when he was resurrected that he would return to Jerusalem. So he was going to return to the Mount of Olives, the place from which he had left. So if you believed in the idea of a devil, a personal devil, Satan, and you were trying to stop the return of Christ, then the best way to do that would be to make sure that there was no Jerusalem for him to return to, or no Jewish Jerusalem for him to return to, which is essentially, in really simple terms, what the last 2,000 years have been about. But the book goes on to talk about 2 very clear parties who are identified in that division. The first of those parties is, and it's very clear that it's a creation which was about, essentially, its primary purpose has been about keeping the Middle East free of Jewish people, and has done that very successfully up until 1948. And the second one is what's glibly referred to in that book as false Christianity, or what it refers to in other terms as the whore of Babylon. And false Christianity is a Christian entity or a Christian philosophy which has sat alongside real Christianity or true Christianity for the last 2,000 years. And basically the book says, hey, those 2 forces between them have been responsible not just for keeping the Jews out of Jerusalem up until 1948, or 1967 in the case of Jerusalem, but also have been the key drivers of anti-Semitism over the last 2,000 years. And that might sound like a glib statement until you start going back and actually looking at what those two parties have done in respect of their relationship with the Jews. It becomes very, very obvious that that's where it's come from. And as I say, its reason is about, very simply, is about keeping Christ, or was about keeping Christ out of Jerusalem by making sure that there was never a Jewish state, which of course has been unsuccessful because there's a Jewish state there again.
Yeah. Wow. Much like probably where the Jew hatred comes from, there's a lot of stuff that gets conjured up within us that fights against the realization of what that might mean. So as we come in for a landing, I want to ask you two questions here. The first, again, as it relates to property, I know it seems so strange talking about the second coming of Christ and a recovery in the property market in one episode, but as it relates to our investment portfolio, and property could be part of it, if it's given that this stuff is true that we've been talking about, should it inform how we hold assets, how we build wealth?
For me, because we don't know how long we've got to go, as I said before, it could be 5 minutes or 20 years or 30 years. I think it behooves. Let me give you an example. So over the last couple of 100 years, there have been a number of cultic movements or semi-church movements that have had a charismatic leader, where the leaders told the followers to go and sell everything and sort of stand on a hill and wait for Christ's return. And that's happened several times, only to be disappointed because they've sold everything, given it to the church, and then Christ didn't reappear. So I think there's a cursory lesson in that, not to do anything foolish or anything that precipitory without thinking through the consequences. So I guess I'd be advising people, to the extent that you can, as you maneuver your way through this, to continue doing what it is that you've been doing, but with your eye being on a different goal. So if your goal primarily before was around financial security and retirement, not that there's anything wrong with that, maybe you also need to have a secondary goal in there, which is making sure that you're assuring your independence in a way which, if circumstances were to change, you would be okay and you'd be able to maneuver that. And that's probably the key difference, I suppose, for a Christian over somebody who's just saying, how can I be comfortable in my dotage?
Yeah. No, I like that way that you framed it as well. And so from a non-financial, from a spiritual perspective, what should, obviously, if none of this is real, no harm done. Just a couple of crazy guys talking on the internet. But if this was real, what is a natural, rational response to this, though, thinking non-financially, if this is real?
Well, that's a really good question, Darcy, because that's got more direct for me over the last 10 or 15 years. I've been a Christian for 40 years, but I was a shocker of a Christian for, 30 of those, but probably more, 35 of those, in that it was kind of a title that I, had amongst other things that I did. It's become increasingly the center of my life. And then it's a question about what that means. So for me, Christianity is about salvation. That's the primary purpose of salvation. In fact, I would say that salvation is the primary purpose of life for all of us. So that's about making sure that I recognize who Jesus Christ is, that he's the Son of God, that his sacrifice was for all, and that in order to be saved and to exist in eternity with him, then I need to have not only accepted that, but to have confessed the sins that I committed leading up to that point. And the second one is this thing about believing in your heart, which is not just saying it, but believing it and confessing with your mouth. And for me, that's the most important thing. Put aside money, put aside politics, because politics comes and go. I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago saying, if you think back to all the stuff that was important to us 5 years ago politically, that's all gone. That's right. And in most cases, the people have gone as well. So that stuff comes and goes. But the faith stuff, that's with us forever, or it's with us until we meet Christ. One day, I was talking to, I keep telling you, I'm talking to people, but it's true. On Saturday, I was having a chat to somebody about the death of Bob Jones. Bob Jones, bigger than life figure in New Zealand. But cast an enormous positive shadow in many respects over this country for a very long period of time. Probably one of the most well-known Kiwis to a generation of New Zealanders. Died with $2 billion in assets, 30 odd buildings in Wellington. And it made a huge impact on the culture of this nation. I don't know where Bob was at with his God in the years leading up to his death. He was certainly an avowed atheist for a long period of his life. I hope he had made his peace with God, because you know what? You can't take all that with you. And ultimately, Bob will be in exactly the same position as you and I and every other person who watches this video will be. One day we will die, and sometime following that, we will be standing in front of Jesus Christ, and we will be required to give an account of our life and what we did with our life, and particularly whether we accepted him or we didn't. And that will determine what happens to us for eternity, forever after. And that doesn't matter whether you're Bob Jones, Darcy and Garrow, Ashley Church, or anybody else. It's exactly the same for all of us.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I'll leave on a really light, superficial question from what we just covered there. What do you think is going to happen with property prices and interest rates for the remainder of 2025?
Interest rates will keep coming down, and depending on primarily what Trump does, let's be honest, depending on what Trump does over the next 6 months, they could come down a little bit faster. So there might be either another 0.25 or 0.5%, or the speed at which we get them down to wherever their base is will come more quickly. And that will bring the cost of money down, obviously. Mortgage interest rates will drop. Interestingly, I've seen the banks have been talking about rates not dropping much lower, which I find fascinating because they're in no position to say that. However, let's see. At some point, and I don't know when this is, and nobody does, Darcy, but at some point we will reach that sweet spot. We will reach that point where people go, okay, it's okay again to get back into the market. To some degree that is tempered by unemployment and the concern about the world economy. So it's going to slow down the rate at which that happens, but it will happen, and it will be tentative initially, and then it will start to gather pace. And as it gathers pace, the market will take off again. It's just that none of us knows when that's going to be.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Where can people go if they want to learn more about what you're putting out there at the moment? Like LinkedIn is probably one of the best places that people can follow you on social media, but is there anywhere else that you can direct people to?
Yeah, so LinkedIn, obviously, I take all comers in terms of connections, although I am getting up toward their limit now. So, but you can follow me; it's easy enough. Subscribe to my newsletter at ashleychurch.com. Very easy to subscribe to, and those come directly to your email inbox. And just a Google search. There's a lot of content out there, and I talk about all manner of weird and wonderful stuff. And anybody who wants to follow that can do that there.
Yeah, ashleychurch.com. I was on there last night. A couple of really interesting articles. You certainly don't churn them out in terms of volume. Clearly, you spend a lot of time actually thinking them through and researching it. Pretty hard to disagree with a lot of the points you're making on those articles as well.
Thank you.
So that's cool. Awesome. Ashley, will you enjoy the rest of your day? Catch up with you soon.